Looks like Halo lore's back on the menu, boys.
Hey guys, welcome back. So 343 just did a massive reveal for the upcoming novel, Halo Epitaph, and good God, this cover art is absolutely insane. I am quite lost for words, to put it lightly. This story is the final part in the Didact story after he was composed in Escalation, after it being previously stated that he actually wasn't able to be composed, but they kind of forgot about that when writing Escalation. Now, yes, you heard me right, this is apparently the final part of the Didact story, and I have some thoughts on that I'm going to touch on later, but first, I've got to talk about all my thoughts and theories on both the cover art and also the metric ton of details that they revealed about the book in the article. So firstly, the cover art. Oh my god, we finally got Punished Didact. If you didn't know, shortly after Halo 4, 343 concepted this like zombie Didact character style for the Didact in Halo 5. Obviously, we didn't end up getting the Didact in Halo 5, they cut him from the game and replaced him with the stuff they did in that game that I don't really want to talk about all that much, so we never saw these insanely cool concepts make the light of day. Until now. When those concepts were first released a few years ago, it's safe to say that everyone, myself absolutely included, absolutely loved them, so it's great to see 343 actually making use of them, even if it's in a bit of a different way. They've also done the same thing for the Halo 5 E3 2013 trailer, which is yet again another fan-beloved trailer that never really saw the light of day in any official, fully developed capacity. This cover art very clearly invokes the cloaked chief wandering through a foreigner desert vibe, and I absolutely love it. So let's dive into the official description of the book, which goes as follows. Stripped of armor, might, and memory, the foreigner warrior known as the Didact was torn from the physical world following his destructive confrontation with the Master Chief and sent reeling into the mysterious depths of a seemingly endless desert wasteland. This once powerful and terrifying figure is now a shadow of his former self, gaunt, broken, desiccated, and alone. But this wasteland is not as barren as it seems. A blue light glints from a thin spire in the far distance. Thus begins the Didact's great journey, the final fate of one of the galaxy's most enigmatic and pivotal figures. The reveal article also then goes on to say that this vast desert that we can see the Didact in is in fact in the domain. So it's not actually physical, rather somehow it's manifested itself in a non-physical form, either for the Didact or by the Didact in the domain. So that poses one big question of many. What significance does the Epitaph and Citadel Tower have to the Didact? Well, there's an obvious answer, which I'm sure you've all seen down there in the title, which we're going to get to in just a minute, don't you worry. But there's also a slightly less obvious answer that's rather metaphorical. If this book does end up being a kind of personal character study kind of story that focuses in on the Didact's thoughts, personality, history, and his reckoning with all of that, which would make sense if he meets his fate at the end of the book, then him walking before the Epitaph Tower could be a metaphor for him facing all that he's done in his lifetime and the effect that he's had on the galaxy now that he's not a major player in it. I mean, the book is quite literally called Halo Epitaph, and it is the Didact after all, so it really wouldn't surprise me if all the different components of this story, both in the cover art and the actual story itself, all had some, like, overtly philosophical deep meaning to them. But then there's the obvious answer, that it has something to do with mendicant bias, which I think is evidenced by the "this wasteland is not as barren as it seems" quote, which to me at least suggests that the Didact isn't the only one in these wastelands. At first he's alone, as it says in the blurb, but maybe throughout the book he realizes that in fact he's not alone in these wastes. There's something buried beneath. Now, for those of you who maybe forgot, because it's been a while since we've covered this, or have no idea what significance mendicant bias has to the Epitaph Tower and the Epitaph map in Halo 3, well, allow me to briefly explain. The Epitaph Tower has basically been confirmed as Mendicant Bias's burial site. After he was bested by offensive bias in the Foreigner Flood War, he was buried in a vast desert on the Ark, which is very similar to the one that surrounds Epitaph. Offensive bias was also left to guard Mendicant Bias's burial site, and the apex of the Epitaph Tower is quite literally watched over by a hologram of offensive bias in an almost angelic manner. And then the actual name of the map and the tower that it's attached to, epitaph. An epitaph is something that is written in memory of somebody who has died, especially as an inscription on a tombstone. Okay, so the Didact is going to be going to the Epitaph Tower that acts essentially as Mendicant Bias's tombstone. But what need does this story have for Mendicant Bias, and why would the Didact want to see this AI again? Well, the Didact was one of the two foreigners, along with Faber the Master Builder, who literally created Mendicant Bias. So if this story does end up being one big reckoning for the Didact for all the death and destruction that he's caused to the galaxy over his hundreds of thousands of years, then facing Mendicant would arguably be the ultimate reckoning, given that it was responsible for probably the most death and destruction that the Halo universe has ever seen, and the Didact was one of the two entities that literally created it. And also, stepping out of the narrative and the lore for a second into the real world, 343 know how much of an aggressive cult following Mendicant Bias has, right? And they know that this tower is essentially synonymous with Mendicant Bias to many fans now, right? They would not have this location be as front and center of this if they weren't going to bring him back. Now, an interesting question that we can ask based on this cover art and the details so far is that if this vast desert that we're seeing here that Mendicant Bias is buried in is in the domain, does that mean that Mendicant Bias was also buried in the domain and not in the kind of physical reality? Well, the laws of physics don't quite line up for that. Granted, this is a universe with galactic space zombies and eldritch monsters that fought ancient humans, and obviously reality went out the window a long time ago, but at the same time it does try to adhere to most laws of physics, and you can't really do that with Mendicant Bias, given that he was still a physical entity when he was buried. That said though, I'm a little bit biased, because I feel like if they went back and made the Epitaph map in Halo 3 and the whole tower that it's in and the desert that surrounds it not actually a tangible space and rather a virtual one, at least to me that would kind of water it down and make it feel a little bit lesser, but that's just me. So running on the assumption that Mendicant Bias was buried at this literal physical tower that exists in the physical world on the Ark, then I imagine that this place the Didact is in is a virtual manifestation of that real burial site on the Ark, which makes me even more convinced that Mendicant Bias is going to play a role in this story in some capacity. Because again, like I just said, why else would this location play such a key role in this story that it's on the damn cover art? The reason this entire megastructure was built was literally to act as a tombstone for Mendicant Bias, so I don't see any way on planet Earth that he doesn't play a part in this story. But back to the Didact, the main focus of the story. What the hell is going to happen with him at the end? Well, my initial hope for this story was that it was going to end with the Didact finding a way out of the domain and back into the physical world. But given that this is essentially, by the sounds of it, his final story, I doubt that's going to happen. My bet now is that the book basically ends with the Didact almost coming to terms with all the death and destruction and damage that he's caused over his lifespan, and then taking up some kind of role or position in the domain in a bet to seek atonement, which would be a really cool parallel with Mendicant Bias. His whole thing in Halo 3 was that he wanted to seek atonement for his betrayal of the Foreigners and his assistance of the Flood and the Primordial by helping Chief defeat the Flood. So if the Didact were to do something similar and try and seek atonement, I do think that would be a really cool parallel. However, that basically puts the Didact in story prison for all intents and purposes. What I mean by story prison is that he's not been completely written out of the universe. If they really wanted to in the future, they could bring the Didact back into a book or a game or something, but for all intents and purposes, his story is finished and he's kind of just irrelevant now, as harsh as that sounds. I really hope that's not the case, because the Didact is one of my favorite Halo characters of all time and I really want to see him come back to the games, but that's how I'm kind of reading this now that they've confirmed it's the final part of his story. I'm also pretty sure we're going to end up seeing his almost reaction to Cortana and the Created and the Warden essentially weaponizing the domain to seize the mantle, given that the Didact was, well, a mantle zealot, if you will. He believed it was an Imperial piece. He was a true believer in the mantle. So seeing how the mantle has been seized and almost contorted by the Created will be something that I imagine he'll have an interesting reaction to. So, thoughts so far? Well, this cover art is goddamn gorgeous. I am in love with this cover art. This kind of speaks to so many of the elements of Halo's lore that I absolutely love. In particular, all the enigmatic parts of Halo 3's terminals and that kind of stuff, mixed in with, of course, the Didact, one of my favorite characters. This book is probably going to end up being one of my favorites if it comes out well. I mean, Kelly Gay's writing it, so it more than likely will do. That said, though, I definitely have some issues with it. Firstly, the story being described as the final fate of the Didact. I really hope this isn't the end of his character for good. I really hope it's not. Regardless of how good this book ends up being, it would be such a gigantic waste if a character as good as the Didact, with as much potential as the Didact, was just written off and never came back to a story or book or game ever again. And my other main issue is, on the topic of games, this just feels like the kind of story that should have been handled in some capacity in a game, not in a book. Granted, we still know very little about the actual meat of the story, but a character as pivotal as the Didact should not go through what is seemingly such a huge character arc off-screen in a book. Even more so if this ends up truly being the end of his story. As soon as a character becomes a core part of a game, to me, that means they're a game character, and game characters should never be relegated to, and especially have their stories end in anything that's not a game. I'm sure this book is going to end up being great, and I can't wait to read it and make videos about it. Really excited, but goddamn, man. It just does kind of suck that we're having a story like this done in a book, when I feel like something this significant really should be done in a game. I think that's been one of 343's main downfalls. They do a lot of this stuff. They focus on books too much with stories that should be told in games. And this just feels like another example of that. And man, maybe I'm biased because I love the Didact so much and I really want it to come back to the games, but it just feels like this is something that should have been done in a game in some capacity. But let me know what you think. What are your thoughts on the cover art and the reveal of the book so far? Are you hyped? Are you excited? It feels good to finally get some new, like, proper Halo lore. As much as I am starting to enjoy the live service narrative, I don't know, it still doesn't feel proper, so to speak. It still feels a little bit forced, whereas this feels like actual proper Halo lore, and it feels so good to be like sinking my teeth into it again. That probably sounded fucking horrific. So I'm going to end the video there. Thank you all very much for watching. Thank you all for the support over on Patreon. I appreciate you all so much. New video coming in a few days. It's a banger, so look forward to that bad boy, and I'll catch you all in the next one.